Now, on the eve of the Tory party conference in Blackpool, we present a special Radio 4 discussion on the future of the centre-right in British politics. Here's Nick Clarke.
Welcome to the heartland of British politics. You join me here on the streets of Westminster in the shadow of the Houses of Parliament to consider a crucial political question. What does the term centre-right mean in the British politics of 1999? With the Labour Party governing on a programme of ostensibly conservative ideas in prudence in economics, toughness in law and order, self-reliance and budget control in welfare. Is politics perhaps merely about management now, each party aspiring to organise the broad centre ground more efficiently than its rivals? Or is there still an attractive centre-right position with a distinctive set of ideas to offer voters, which could provide an ideological counterbalance, the sort of balance on which modern politics thrives? To discuss these questions, we're coming just around the corner from the Carlton Club, where Conservatives have been meeting and thinking since 1832. Conservative central office is in Smith Square, about a quarter of a mile away, and Downing Street a few hundred yards along Whitehall in the opposite direction. And here, under the gaze of Big Ben, we're arriving at Great George Street, 1 Great George Street, the distinguished surroundings of the Institute of Civil Engineers, where, before a mixed audience of MPs, peers, constituency workers and academics, we'll hear those issues debated. There'll be politicians on the platform, Michael Heseltine, Stephen Dorrell and David Willits. And in about an hour from now, we'll try to see if we can produce a centre-right equivalent to Labour's 5 early pledges, simply policy imperatives to help determine the themes of the next general election. But we begin with a panel we've dubbed The Thinkers, and our first contributor is the former Tory Treasury Minister Philip Oppenheim. Since he lost his Amber Valley seat in the 97 election, he's had more time and reason than some to find an answer to the question we're posing. For the time being, he's a columnist for the Sunday Times and owner of a Cuban bar restaurant not far from here. Philip Oppenheim, give us some ideas.
Well, I think it's fair to say the Tories at the moment and the centre-right have got something of a problem. The problem is that the Conservatives won quite a lot, if not all of the arguments, in the 1980s. In a sense, the problem is that Blair has accepted the Thatcher consensus, which was forged in the late 70s and 80s, every bit as much as in an earlier era a Tory government accepted the Attlee consensus after they came to power in 1951. One obvious solution which has been touted for, well, since before the election is, do we therefore go and put clear blue water, this cliché, in between us and New Labour? I think there's a danger with clear blue water. It looks quite enticing. It can be quite cool when you dive in, but the problem is it can be very deep, there can be nowhere to swim to, and it can get very cold if you're not careful. And there's another issue. Just because someone clambers onto your own little island doesn't necessarily mean it's a bad island and therefore you should hop off and look for somewhere else. I think we've got to accept that the Conservatives were broadly right in supporting free enterprise, liberal democracy in the 1970s and 1980s, and that's no reason, therefore, necessarily to try and move away from those basic policies. One area I think you can get differentiation is matching traditional Tory belief in freedom in the economic sphere with liberty in the personal and social sphere. And this is an area that I think Conservatives have been very bad on in the past. Lady Thatcher was happy as Larry with multinationals doing what they wanted to round about the place. By and large, she wasn't very happy with individuals doing what they wanted. And I think there is an agenda to be carved out for Conservatives to match, to be consistent, economic freedom with personal and social liberty. Areas like censorship. We are the most censored nation in Europe. We're even more censored than the United States. Licensing laws, where our licensing laws, and there are reasons for them in some areas, but in a lot of areas there aren't. We have the toughest licensing laws in Europe. We treat people as though they can't drink in public. And another area is, I don't think we should be too prescriptive in pushing forward what are called family policies, which are now very popular, I know, in the party, but I think could potentially be prescriptive and dangerous.
Philip Oppenheim, thank you very much. I'm sure your appeal for changing the licensing laws had nothing to do with your other temporary profession as a Cuban bar owner. Right. Our next speaker, our next thinker is Perry Six. He's Senior Research Fellow at the Department of Government at Strathclyde University and at the independent think tank Demos. He's also the author of a book called On the Right Lines, the Next Centre-Right in the British Isles. Perry Six.
I do think that elections in this country are won in the centre ground. And the central task for the Conservative Party is to recover some of that centre ground. The Conservative Party no longer has a monopoly on articulating the interests of business in Britain. And that's why I think it's particularly important that the party rediscovers some of its liberalism about markets. And with that, we'll be able to tell a more convincing story than New Labour can about the interests of particularly big business, which at the moment appears not wholly lost, but certainly no longer loyal to the Conservative Party. Of course, the centre-right is, and always must be, a treaty between liberty and authority. But the role of authority can no longer credibly be expressed in terms of what the Taliban tendency in the centre-right has sometimes wanted about family life. Secondly, we live with many identities, local, regional, national, by community, by interest group. And the centre-right can no longer credibly believe or expect voters to believe that the nation-state is the place where policies are made, where decisions that really matter are always made, and where fates are determined, peoples protected or exposed, and cultures shifted. I think at this point, here in 1999, it is very easy for many on the centre-right to feel that somehow their role is to put their fingers in the dikes of change and of social and economic change. I think it is much more important, indeed centrally important to the revival of the centre-right, that it tells an optimistic story about what is possible and not merely sets itself as the force of defiance against larger forces of change which it no longer feels it can control or influence.
Thank you very much, Perry Six. Well, finally, in this group of free thinkers, we've got the Daily Mail columnist Simon Heffer, author of the book Nor Shall My Sword, The Reinvention of England. He's also credited with inventing the concept of Essex man and woman, the quintessential floating voters who embraced Thatcherism, but then, of course, dumped John Major in favour of Tony Blair. Simon Heffer.
Well, I agree with much of what Perry and Philip Oppenheim have said, not least in the importance of the centre-right, the Conservative Party, coming to terms with the challenge presented to them by the fact that we have a Labour government that has stolen much of their agenda. Now, Tories of all descriptions use Winston Churchill to justify everything, but one of his many apophthegms was that the purpose of the Conservative Party was to defend the constitutional sovereignty of this country. Many, but not all, Conservatives believe it is the job of the centre-right to maintain a proper level of democratic accountability for the British Parliament by MPs, for the British people, by ensuring that power continues to reside as much as possible at Westminster. The centre-right needs to appeal to public concerns about the nascent European superstate, which remains at heart a socialist project, and to the fear that England has been gravely disadvantaged politically, strategically, and economically by devolution. The authoritarianism of this government should be contrasted by the centre-right parties in this country with what should be the implicit anti-statist message of the Conservative right. And I think that conclusions can be drawn about the way that certain domestic institutions in this country are falling into disrepair and contempt, notably the National Health Service and the education system, by talking about the authoritarianism of the government and the way that it has had a disadvantageous effect on those institutions by removing them from proper political accountability and allowing them, if you like, to become banana republics. So what the Conservatives should argue for is a strong framework of laws, a strongly accountable Parliament, and within that strong framework and that strong accountability, going for the liberal running of institutions of the sort that Philip Oppenheim outlined in his message earlier. I think it's fundamentally important, though, that the Conservative Party reminds people that without the protection of democratic accountability, governments can more or less do anything. And that is dangerous enough when it's the government of this country. If it turns out to be the government of a superstate that nobody elects, that will be even graver.
Thank you all very much indeed. Well, those are really the last sort of full statements we shall have. We're going to be, I hope, slightly more fluid now. But just before we move on to our other panellists, I'm going to ask each of the three of you, and I noticed, listening to you speak, that I didn't hear any of those old credos that one perhaps would expect to hear when people of the centre-right are looking to how to rebuild confidence of the voters. I'm thinking of things like dealing with union power, law and order, immigration, all those old nostrums, if you like. Philip Oppenheim, just a very brief sentence from each of you. You didn't mention any of these. Is there any particular reason? Have they lost their potency in this consensus politics about which you've been speaking?
I think they're highly potent. I think certainly law and order is highly potent, but there's very little between the parties in terms of policies to tackle law and order. I think in terms of unions, basically, the new Labour government have taken on about 85 to 90% of Tory reforms, all of which they oppose, so I don't think at the moment it's a big issue.
Perry Six, what about some of these old ideas which normally at a Tory conference would be expected to generate a wave of enthusiasm and delight?
The core, it seems to me, of the Conservative challenge is not simply to tell a story about how we stop certain evils, but how we promote a vision of what modern life could be. And if conservatism remains, as far as most electors are concerned, a series of crackdowns against bogies, then it will not be credible.
And Simon Heffer, one thing you didn't discuss was this reinvention of England, which really emerges from your book. Is that an important part of your review of the constitutional arrangements in this country?
I think we must wait and see what happens in the 2003 election in Scotland. If the SNP were to become the government in Scotland, and if they were to proceed to have a referendum on an independent Scotland, then I think it would concentrate minds very greatly in England about the amount of money that is spent. It's £8 billion a year at the moment as a subsidy, which goes from the English taxpayer to the Scots taxpayer. And once the English actually wake up to what they're paying for Scottish devolution and possibly might pay for Scottish independence, then I think that the Conservative Party will have some grounds for, as it were, campaigning on an English ticket.
Okay, thank you very much. Well, we've had three broad brush pictures of what I think is considered to be some of the essential elements of a new centre-right. Simon Heffer's talking about accountability of public institutions, the belief that government must be prepared to surrender authority and power to the places it really belongs. Perry Six talked about that. Philip Oppenheim's concept of a new age of freedom in social and cultural affairs. We've also heard pleas to fight the bulking out of the state. That was how Simon Heffer put it, I think. There is, of course, no means, this is not only a British phenomenon, what's happened to the centre-right. 11 of the 15 EU countries have left-of-centre governments at the moment, 13 if you count coalitions. And we're going to hear a couple of views from overseas about this particular phenomenon. Firstly, Pierre Lelouch. He's one of President Chirac's most important advisors. At present, he's a Gaullist deputy in Paris, and this, if you listen, is his perspective.
The left has essentially stolen most of the stuff we had on shelf, namely economic reform, lowering public spending, trying to lower taxes, competitiveness, economic competition. All of that is gone, as is gone also the themes of national interest, European integration. In Britain, you have a left, which is presumably left, but which essentially would be on the right of the French right, and is essentially implementing the same policy as the last 20 years with Madame Thatcher and John Major. In Germany, you have a so-called left, which is implementing a classic liberal center-right policy. Probably France today is the only true left-wing government in place. Most of Europe is already on a center-right line. One of the crucial issues ahead for the very future of democracy is to see what are the fault lines. And for the moment, we are facing a tremendous ideological void, both on the left and on the right, and people have great difficulties trying to define who they are.
That was the view of Pierre Lelouch in Paris. Now, in the United States, too, the right has failed so far much to capitalize on the troubles of President Clinton. They have hopes of Governor George Bush Jr. Charles Murray is a celebrated conservative commentator, author of The Bell Curve, and a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute. He believes populist policies are the key, such as a presumption that no one should bear a tax burden of more than 25% of their earnings, or that the nanny state should be limited, that we don't need protection against the consequences of our own actions. We've already heard a whisper of that already in our thinkers' views, but here is Charles Murray's view. In a short, he wants a determined stand on immovable principles.
The only way that the right is going to make these effective is if they don't back down. If they don't, as they have done in the United States, follow this wishy-washy, mealy-mouthed, gee, you know, we want to help the poor too, but we want to just be more sensible about it than the left is. That's just not going to work. I think we're at kind of a testing point for the Republican Party. They now have George W. Bush. One scenario says that George Bush wins next year, and it turns out that he is Reagan in disguise, and that right-wing politics once again are in the ascendancy. Another scenario says actually George Bush is his father's son, and he may win next year, but it's going to be a distinction without a difference as far as policies are concerned from George Bush. Unless George Bush turns out to be ideologically important and have real opinions, I don't see what point the Republican Party has in the American system anymore. I mean, why do we need two centrist parties?
And that, I think, goes to the nub of the issue for the centre-right in Britain as well. Why do you need two centre-right parties if you've already got one, which is one of the ideas which has been suggested to us. Now, I'm going to call on another of our expert panels. We're calling them scrutineers, people who wish the centre-right well but are prepared to criticise it when it loses its way. And first we're going to hear from Michael Gove, leader writer for The Times, biographer of Michael Portillo. Michael Gove, have you heard, do you think, in the views of our thinkers, the sorts of elements that would make up the sort of centre-right you recognise?
There are some elements in what Philip Oppenheim said and some in what Simon Heffer said, which I consider promising. However, I saw little in what Perry Six said, which would give me heart for the revival of a centre-right. One of the things which I think is important is to recognise that outside the seminar room in which we're operating, phrases like left, right and centre have remarkably little resonance. Perry Six said all elections were won in the centre ground. That's nonsense. Margaret Thatcher didn't win elections in the centre ground. She's the most successful Prime Minister of this century. Elections are won not by leaders being centrist, not by people saying, I like him or her, he or she splits the difference. Elections are won by leaders who are strong rather than weak and who have messages which are appropriate rather than irrelevant or extreme or outdated. I also particularly thought that Perry was, curiously enough for a representative of Demos, out of date in suggesting that Conservatives should need to forge a new alliance or renew their alliance with big business. I think one of the things that Conservatives should recognise now is that big business is actually a threat to freedom and a threat to values that Conservatives hold dear. We've seen big business behave in the last 10 or 15 years in a manner which is increasingly heedless of traditional freedoms and increasingly heedless of traditional loyalties. We've got to recognise that big business is involved in a corporatist embrace with the Labour Party, an embrace which is squeezing the little man whom the Conservatives should be attempting to defend.
Come back and let you finish that in a moment, but you have raised Perry Six's hackles over there, so briefly, Perry Six, please.
Of course, Mrs. Thatcher won many of her elections in the centre ground. You wouldn't have gotten majorities like that if she had simply occupied the hardline space. If I'm being accused of being out of date, then let me turn the accusation around. There is surely nothing more out of date than the idea that the centre ground is wishy-washy, lacking in clear opinions or direction. That may have been true in perhaps the immediate post-war years, but if we look around the politics of the developed world today, far from lack of clarity or wishy-washiness, it is the centre ground which has been the source of the major creativity. Finally, on big business, well, whenever business and politics get the relationship wrong, then you will get the kind of squalor that you describe. I could find that with small business and many local councils. The issue about squalid relationships between politicians and business is nothing to do with size. It is to do with what fundamentally a party or an ideology has to say about the role of business.
Okay.
And that is something which, it seems to me, the centre-right can offer something credible and much more powerful in its essentially liberal ideas about what big business should be and can be for.
All right, now I interrupted you, Michael Gove, in the middle of your last appeal for the little man, little woman.
Not at all. It's quite right to allow Perry his point of view, but I'm glad that he concedes that the relationship between politicians and business is often squalid. It's the role of business not to get involved in relationships, but to arbitrate relationships. It's also the role of politicians to respond to specific concerns. I'm glad that you mentioned law and order, Nick, because I think it's a vitally important issue. I think that for many people, again outside the seminar room, there is still an element of bewilderment that the criminal justice system doesn't seem accurately to respond to their values. I think that what we have to recognise is that if the right, as defined, has won economic battles over the last 20 years, it has also lost significant cultural battles over the last 20 years. And I think it's important for us to recognise that some of the values of our culture, understood by people outside the seminar room, are not accurately represented by those who have responsibility for discharging policy in both main parties.
Thank you. Our second scrutineer is Howell Williams, once a policy advisor to John Redwood when he was in John Major's cabinet, now an author and historian. Among his works, Guilty Men, a withering assessment of John Major's time in office. How could things be better done now?
One thing seems to me certainly true when you look at the political history of the 20th century in Britain, and that is that Britain is not actually that conservative a country, not politically conservative with a big C. I mean, the three really important general election victories have been victories actually of the left and the centre-left in 1906, 1945, and then in 1997. Consistently, the British people have voted for a fair degree of state intervention in their lives. And the period that we're going through now is actually a classic period of modified capitalism in that way.
When Conservatives were able to fight their way back from those setbacks that you mentioned, what happened? What was it that enabled them to, did they shift the ground, or did the people shift, or what?
What happened in 1945 was the Conservative Party went on to accept the historic settlement of 1945, sort of in domestic terms.
Does that have implications for now?
I think it does, because we need to be very careful about not over-interpreting the significance of the Thatcher victories. The Thatcher victories were systematically over-interpreted, I think, by Conservative commentators, because they forget the extent and the depth of the divide on the left during that period. Margaret Thatcher was only getting 43–44% of the popular vote. In 1956 and 59, Anthony Eden and Harold Macmillan were winning with 48–49% of the popular vote.
Right. Okay, and our third scrutineer is the editor of the Daily Telegraph, Charles Moore. His paper's unrelenting attacks on John Major's government, particularly on Europe, were widely assumed to have contributed to the Tories' desperate showing in 1997. Charles, have you heard so far the sort of elements that you'd like to see make the sort of party that you would like to write nice leaders about?
No, I haven't really at all. I would like to question the premise of all this discussion, which is that New Labour is basically conservative. I think this is about 95% of fiction. And I think people only really say it because Tony Blair did one very brilliant thing, which he worked out that most people who comment on public affairs pay the top rate of tax. And if he were going to, and if he was going to make them feel secure, he would promise them that he would not put up the top rate of tax. And so I should think everyone on this panel pays the top rate of tax. And so they don't feel so bad and so threatened as they otherwise would have done. And that lulls them all into talking nonsense. The fact is, this is not a crypto-conservative government. Though the top rates and the headline rates are unaltered, tax is up, regulation is up, interference of all sorts by government is up. It's not a morally conservative government. It has attacked marriage and taken marriage altogether out of the taxation system, any benefit for marriage. It's in favour of lowering the age of consent for homosexuals. In its attitude to Europe, it's thoroughly Europhile, I mean cautiously so, but thoroughly Europhile, and determined gradually to get us into the single European currency.
If your analysis is correct, if there is no problem of the centre-right ground having been taken by another party, what does that imply in terms of how the centre-right that is not part of the Blair project should define itself and how it should behave?
Well, the first thing it's got to do is work out what it's up against. This lot are in opposition now. They still can't see that because they've been bludgeoned or drugged by 18 years in office. They're in opposition. They should oppose. Nobody tonight has been talking about opposing. And that's the first thing you need to do. You need to show up the sham of this government.
Thank you very much. No, we'll come back to you later on, if we may. Our thinkers have done some thinking. Our scrutineers have cast a preliminary eye over, and sometimes a jaundiced eye, over some of the elements which might make up a new centre-right philosophy. Now, I'm going to turn to a group of people who are drugged by years in power, not realising they're in opposition. It's the politicians. And first we're going to hear from Michael Heseltine, an MP since 1966, Deputy Prime Minister in the last government. Michael Heseltine, do you think that we now have two very clear views here? One is that opposing is the first job. Another is that planning needs to be done in order to position yourself against the time when you have to fight Labour at the polls. Which of those two things seems important to you? Is there a job to be done now? And where should the Tory party be positioning itself? Has an ideology got to be developed at this time in the political cycle?
We certainly haven't got to develop an ideology because we have one. It is a question of updating it in the context that we will face in the next general election. The Tory party, broadly speaking, has had a philosophy which has kept it going as the most successful political party in human democratic history for hundreds of years. So it would be very unwise for it to jettison all that on the assumption that Labour has suddenly turned into a Conservative party.
Not altogether recognisable, are they? The strains which have kept it together, they have shifted with the times, haven't they?
But basically there has been an instinct for country, a belief in individual, a sense of pride in the past, a confidence about the future, and a balance and fairness in the way this country was kept united. So I wouldn't begin to suggest we need a new ideology. There are no new ideologies. That's a ridiculous concept. But when I listen to Charles Murray dismissing the need to help the poor, well, I have a problem. I actually believe in helping the poor. And the reason the Tories have been in power for so long and so often is precisely because they have always been better at helping the poor than the Labour Party, who were better at talking about helping the poor. And so you've got two questions you put to me, and I'm very clear about the answer. Charles is 100% on the button. The duty of opposition is to oppose. And when you've got the guy on the floor, jump on him. That is actually, that is what you're there to do. To
what if he's got his foot on your neck still?
Well, but that takes you on to the second point, that at this moment, the inheritance, the economic inheritance for most governments in the world, in the Western world, is extremely benign. And there is no disgruntlement out there in the electorate. That's why they don't bother to vote. That's why the opinion polls keep this honeymoon for the government going. And the same process is at work in the United States, who allowed Clinton to get away with well, you describe it any way you like. And the fact of the matter is, until that changes, you don't get that constituency of fury building up, pent-up need for change, which actually provides oppositions with their chance. But that is your second question. You ought to be thinking about what you might be saying to update your philosophies. And if I was giving one, well, there are two areas in which I would advise the Conservative Party to now go on to a more positive approach. The first is our cities. Labour baronies run our cities. Our cities are characterized by some of the most appalling standards of urban squalor anywhere in Western Europe.
Does that relate to what was being said from our thinkers, which was that, or talking about
I mean, I don't want to equate myself with thinkers. I'm just a practical, I'm just a practical old politician. I would go for the jugular of the Labour Party in the cities, where they preside over and benefit from squalor. And we can win council seats, we can do something about the issue, and we should be saying that in order then to create a new opportunity of rebuilding Britain's great cities, we will actually have directly elected mayors, we will pay them properly, and we will give them powers by cutting the intrusion of central government.
But the point I was going to put, I was just on that, on the point I was going to make, so give more power back to local authorities that you took away?
Trust the people. Trust the people. Okay. And that is absolutely at the heart of what we should be doing. The second point is absolutely fundamental, and it was, I think it was Perry Six who referred to it, but I may have got that wrong. The nature of the nation-state is changing at a pace which is hardly perceived by the vast majority of the electorate. And if we don't come to terms with the world of the 21st century, in which Britain's influence in the world will be wholly dependent upon its strength within the European community, we are going to lose the opportunity to sell a new vision to an emerging generation. And until the Tory party comes to terms with that, we are going to be divided, and in being divided, we're going to be weakened.
Okay, but we may come back to that later, possibly. Our second politician is Stephen Dorrell, formerly Health Secretary, unsuccessful leadership candidate, a man who left William Hague's shadow cabinet specifically to think about the way his party's policies might develop. Now, how do these ideas you've been hearing tonight fit in with what you've been thinking? Do they seem to you to be forming the basis in which positive ways forward can be found?
Well, the single thing I heard from the scrutineers that I most wholeheartedly agreed with was also from Charles Moore. It was a slightly different point from the one Michael picked up. What basis do we have for presenting a choice to them? We should also, it seems to me, stop using the first Conservative cousin of that argument, which is the proposition that the Conservatives won the argument. If you went round the doorsteps in the 1997 general election, there was precious little evidence among the voters that they felt the Conservatives had won the argument. I think it's a comfortable self-delusion that we won the argument. The truth is, we lost the plot. And what we now have to do is to show how the ideas that Michael refers to, that have sustained the Conservative Party, are indeed relevant again, and can be made relevant.
But these are ideas which which you lost the plot, they were rejected, you're saying, or they weren't properly presented. Are they the same ideas we're hearing now but that have been put forward tonight, or are they new ideas?
Well, one of the most absurd propositions is the proposition that says, we won the argument for liberal economic reform. Therefore, this is an issue that we don't any longer have to address. Anybody who actually looks at what is going on in the world marketplace can see that change hasn't come to a stop simply because the Conservative Party's left office. Actually, the pace of change is increasing day by day, year by year. And it's the job of the government of this country to ensure that our economic structures, whether we're talking about labour market, whether we're talking about our relationships in Europe, whether we're talking about Europe's relationship beyond into Eastern Europe and the wider world, to ensure that the political structures change sufficiently fast to allow British business, as part of a wider European economic structure, British business to create wealth, create jobs, and allow people to earn their earn rising living standards. The proposition that economic reform came to an end because the Conservatives won the argument is, to my mind, such a self-evidently absurd proposition that I fail to understand how it can persuade people.
Thank you. Our third politician is one of William Hague's senior spokesmen on social security, David Willits. He's risen swiftly through the party ranks after 2 years as a member of the Downing Street Policy Unit and a further 5 at the Centre for Policy Studies, gaining a reputation as one of the party's more radical thinkers and the daunting nickname Two Brains. Now, you can apply either or both of those to this question, and probably have. What you've heard so far, does it start to you to seem to produce a shape? I mean, now we have a lot of disparate ideas here. It's hard to see how they're going to come together. We're going to try and do that job in a minute. How does it look to you?
Yeah, I take two things from what we've heard so far. First of all, there is still a theme about freedom, which is both economic freedom, and as Philip said at the very beginning, it is wider personal freedoms as well. Charles Moore was quite right. If you sit watching them close up in the House of Commons, every day they pass another regulation, they want to ban something, or alternatively make it compulsory, but one of the two. They have moved further to impose new burdens on the economy in the 2 years since they've been in office than we moved to liberalise in the first 2 years that we're in office after 1979. There is a nannying, a prissiness, a bossiness. So there is a theme here of give us a break, which is both economic freedom and, more widely, people should be free to shape their own lives. That is still a powerful theme, and people who say, oh, Labour are just like us, are simply not observing the reality of their behaviour in office. But there is a second theme too, which I don't think we've touched on so much, and which is what differentiates conservatism from simply being the party of the free market and freedom, and that is some sense of our identity as a nation, what it is that holds us together, what is distinctive about being British, and a belief by Blair that somehow he's got to do to the country what he's done to the Labour Party. And he doesn't. He should leave the country alone. He doesn't need to do to the country what he's done to the Labour Party. So one person advising him was quoted as saying, we inherited a feudal country and we're going to turn it into a Napoleonic one. And I don't want to be in a Napoleonic country where the constitution is torn up, where we become part of a wider European structure, where a lot of understandings about how things are done are jettisoned. And I think that is a threat to our sense of who we are, and it is also a fundamental misreading of what a global economy is like.
Well, what are the positive policies that put that into place and prevent that happening? Did you have the chance?
Well, I think that on the Constitution and on Europe, some sense of, I think Simon Heffer referred to this, strengthening Parliament, understanding what it is, what Englishness is, alongside Scottishness and being Welsh, complete rejection of regionalism, which is a bogus solution to a problem they've created themselves as a result of devolution. Localism, which Stephen rightly referred to, where England is a localist country, we're not a regionalist country. Respecting civic identity and trying to understand that the right response to globalization is not to say we've got to be more like everyone else, but we've got to be more different. The right response in a global market is to be distinctive. And he is embarrassed, and New Labour is embarrassed, about what makes our country distinctive. And some combination of freedom rooted in a traditional and stable community and set of institutions, I think Michael was right. It's been the Conservative message for centuries, and it is not what Blair practices, nor even what he preaches.
All right. Thank you very much. We're reaching a stage in these proceedings where we've heard a large number of views, a strong sense maybe that the time has not yet come to stop opposing. That came from Charles Moore, but also some preparedness to look beyond that, and a whole range of ideas from fighting against the expansion of the state, the promotion of economic continence, from forming a new contract between state authority and individual liberty, a lot about individual liberty, shaking off connections with big business. We heard from Michael Gove, a return to Gladstonian liberalism, a plea for local mayors, a certain amount on Europe as well. There's a whole range of ideas here. And one of the most innovative elements of Labour's 1997 campaign was the reduction of the party's main aspirations to these 5 easily understood initiatives, which they hope would be deliverable, distinctive, and yet part of a coherent whole. And just as part of our exercise tonight, it's not supposed to be the be-all and end of it, I would like to try and find, first of all with the scrutineers, in a blatant piece of plagiarism, what sort of things might go on that card for this Tory party at this stage in the cycle as it goes round the doorstep. So, Michael Gove, Hal Williams and Charles Moore, what sort of ideas might go on that card that we might be able to beat out and maybe agree on?
I mentioned law and order earlier. I think that one of the things which most bewilders the public is the way in which there's no clarity in sentences, and there seems to be no appropriate match between public outrage at certain horrific crimes and sentences passed. I think honesty and appropriateness in sentencing might be one. I think Michael Heseltine was right about the nature of our cities. I think we should make another pledge to transform derelict areas of our city and to build our new houses in brownfield rather than greenfield sites. I think that the protection of our precious and disappearing environment is a vital issue which people instinctively understand Conservatives can speak to. I also think that on schools, one of the things that the Conservatives should offer is the maximum freedom of choice, by which I mean money delivered in a voucher, which allows total freedom for parents to send their children to any school and allows schools to expand to whatever size to absorb these new pupils, and also allows private organisations to run schools for profit, specifically in order to ensure that an effective market operates in education as it does in food, the other great necessity of life.
What about Hal Williams? Oh, a round of applause, why not? Hal Williams, what about some ideas for my card here?
I think that the Labour Party is very, very exposed on education, which has been one of the great failures of all governments in this country since 1945. And in 2 or 3 years' time, they will have to deliver their previous pledge on education. I think that the Conservative Party should think very seriously, not so much about the mechanism of delivery of good education. One of the problems about, I think, the Conservatives in the past few years is they talked endlessly about the way schools are run. Whereas, what we want are good schools, not particularly schools that are run as GM or any other sort of mechanism of running them. We want higher standards in examining. We want sort of better teachers in schools. The Conservative Party should think really about, in government, introducing a new national exam, a baccalaureate with sort of high standards. When we think about localism and regional identities, Conservatives should certainly not be in favour of creating more and more politicians. And one of the problems that Conservatives do generally face, I think, is a problem common to all politicians in this age, is that there's less and less for politicians to do. I mean, we do live in a post-political age in that sense. And that's a particular problem. But it's one that Conservatives should live with very happily, because Conservatives should not actually be that keen on politics.
How would that formulate itself into a policy idea? I mean, that's a general thought.
I think we want to have more and more powers devolved to local authorities. And that would be a very good thing for former Conservative councillors and new Conservative councillors as well. We're sort of bursting for things to do in the years to come.
All right, Charles Moore.
The most basic thing that hasn't been talked about is that the Conservatives should be the low-tax party. And they should be going all the time to cut taxes. It's an absolute myth that the British people always say in an opinion poll that they would rather pay more tax because if that could get better health and education. I'm afraid that is just hypocrisy on the part of the British people, one of our great, beautiful national characteristics. If you actually do make people pay more tax, they don't vote for you.
How would you formulate this? Because every election I can remember since I was old enough to understand the word election, people have promised me lower taxes. Each party has been a party of lower taxation. How do you formulate that into something like those 23-word promises on that Labour card that people might even believe?
Well, I think you have to get into an auction for lower taxes, which, of course, is very frightening for you because you can't think of where to cut and you don't want to tell anybody where you're going to cut because that will annoy someone.
Do you have to face up to that?
Yeah, well, you have to be the party that's pushing for lower taxes. You can't win if you're not in that position. Labour understood that perfectly well at the last election. And finally, of the key things you're asking for, the Tories must go all out, say no to the euro. 76% of the population, despite years of bludgeoning, say no to the euro. It's absolutely vital part of our political and economic life. And any ambiguity about that weakens the Conservative Party. Labour is onto a loser about that as they're beginning to realise that the Tories are onto a winner and need to go more strongly.
Thank you. Well, those ideas, we'll try and elide some of those ideas in a minute. We've got crime. We have attention to the cities and local authorities returning some of the power to them. We've had talk of schools, maximum freedom of choice and vouchers. We're getting rid of quangos, talking about a much clearer attitude to crime and a low-tax party. As Charles Moore says, he also wants the party to say, or the centre-right, to be able to say never, never to the euro. Now, those are some of the ideas which might go onto this basic card of ideas and themes. So what about from the audience? Are there any people in the audience who would like, if you wouldn't mind waiting, if you indicate that you'd like to add some of these to this list or make some contributions to this point in the debate, we'd be glad to hear from you. If you'd like to sort of, for my purposes and help, if you could name yourself before you speak.
Robert Jackson, the Member of Parliament for Wantage. I think that ideas and political developments are really very closely connected with the experience of politics. And I think the basic problem that we now face is that there is a contradiction between the commitment that both main parties have to reducing taxation as a share of national product, on the one hand, and on the other hand, to continuing to deliver ever-improving qualities of public services, education and health, which is free at the point of delivery. I think there's a fundamental contradiction, which you can't escape by trying to get efficiency up by reorganization, which has basically been the approach of the last government and is to some extent the approach of the present government. I think the basic dilemma comes down to this. Are we prepared to pay for those public services at the level that people want them to be by increasing taxation, or are we going to go down a new route? And I think we should be looking as a Conservative Party at a new route, which would be basically to get people to contribute at the time that they use the services some part of the cost of those services.
Thank you. Let's take some other views here, please, either side of the aisle here.
John Townend. I think we've got to get one thing clear. The public did not reject Conservative values at the last election. It rejected a Conservative government which the public thought had rejected Conservative values. We were the party who were elected on a basis of low taxation. We put taxes up. We were the party of small business and deregulation. We regulated more than any government in history. And I speak as an owner of a small and medium-sized business. And what's interesting is the suggestions coming from the panel are all to go back to basic Conservative principles. And I noted the headings, and most of them have been mentioned. But I do think the most important is the Tory party is the party of the nation, or it is nothing. And not only must we be the party against a single currency, we must make it clear the Labour Party is the party of federal Europe, a Europe of regions. We are the party of the nation state. And we must extend that and represent the English. It has been meant for the English. And one other thing you've said, I think it's two other things. We should be the party of less politics and less politicians, and that would be very, very popular.
Well, that's what happened at the last election.
Less politicians overall. We're getting more and more politicians, councillors, what have you.
And across the aisle, thank you.
John Barnes, London School of Economics. We've got to make decentralisation work. That means really going down to county government, but you've got to make sure the county councillors are accountable to the electorate, and that means finding a tax which finances virtually the whole of local government spending, which actually gets the electors out to vote. So transfer income tax to local government.
Now that would be a bold move. Politicians, we've got quite a lot of early pledges here, rather more than 5, but you can see the shape of things emerging. Do these sorts of areas that you've heard here, we're talking about the cities, some of the things you've mentioned yourselves, school vouchers, we've heard some talk about the euro, we've talked about the English dimension of regionalism. Do these things start to feel like the elements that would form the part, let's say, David Willits, of a manifesto, if not a card?
Yeah, I think that these are very, very promising themes. I mean, I think the idea that we are being over-governed with too many complicated tiers of politicians is a very powerful theme, and giving more power back to the locality, yes. I like low taxes. I think people have not yet mentioned the family. Charles referred to it very briefly, but fairness for families, and the sense that families are trying to do a tough job in a hostile environment and need more support, including in some way through the tax or benefit system. I think that's another powerful theme.
Okay, I'm going to come back to the other politicians to tidy this up in a minute, but first of all, thinkers. Your thoughts have been thrown up in the air, they've been tossed about, they've been scrutinised, they've had some political comment. Do these ideas that have emerged here, that came forward as possible ways of addressing the public directly on this, do they seem to you to add up to the sort of thing you're looking for in the centre-right party?
Yes, I think the point that impressed me most from the floor, I think, was Robert Jackson's about the short...
At this point, our panel of thinkers took up some of the audience's ideas and added a few more of their own. Tax breaks were proposed by Simon Heffer for those who take out insurance for their own health care. Perry 6 called for half of all local government expenditure to be financed locally and up to 1/10 of spending on criminal justice to be voted to crime prevention. He also wanted to see a transatlantic free trade agreement. For Philip Oppenheim, support for a wholly elected House of Lords was the key, and with a hint of irony perhaps, a scheme to adopt the Labour theme tune, Things Can Only Get Better, as his comment on the shortcomings of the Blair government. Would such ideas appeal to the politicians? First, I asked Michael Heseltine.
I think in the sort of summation of the ideas we just listened to from the thinkers, I think you called them, was that you would put the Tory party out of power for a generation. And I would be sad about that. Let me try 5 slogans, which I think are close to the real world. The first issue, deregulation, privatisation, helping small businesses, give the people a chance. Point 2, let's rebuild our cities by giving the people the power to do so. Point 3, make Westminster matter in Brussels. Create a second chamber to the European Parliament representing the parliaments of the nation states. Point 4, national identity card linking tax and social security. One calculation. Point 5, a lifetime deal, education and employment. In order to ensure that nobody is left on the streets, they have to give time in order to achieve benefit.
Isn't that exactly what the Labour Party is trying to do? Isn't that one area where that's the welfare to work idea?
It's what we actually put in place, and it needs building on. The trouble with this government is that where they have adopted our ideas, they have adopted the language in many cases. They have no appetite to carry the ideas through. There are a whole range of things that could be extended, of which this is one. A positive approach to what is called in American terms workfare, but it's actually saying that if you have benefit from the state, you must give time in return for it. We will educate and train you and re-educate and retrain you. What we will not allow you to do is to sit at home and do nothing. And I think that'd be very popular.
Stephen Dorrell, you've had now an alternative set of 5 ideas. You may pick whichever one you choose. Which one seems more attractive to you?
Well, I've got a number of things going down here. Law and order, I agree with those who say that that's at the centre. Simple slogan there, will recruit the police force back to the levels it was when we left office. Secondly, I'm in favour of more power to cities, directly elected mayors. I wouldn't confine it to cities. Why should the shire counties be excluded? Let's have directly elected sheriffs as well. I agree with Robert Jackson, greater freedom for universities, independence even for universities, and if you want to be really bold, why not independence for schools as well, so that they don't accept diktats from the centre. Tax-free savings, that's something we were working our way towards. We ought to set ourselves back on that escalator. And finally, if we're going to talk about Europe, I'd like to see us spend less time talking about the euro and more time talking about the kind of liberal, free-trading, outward-looking, competitive Europe in which we can earn a rising standard of living for our people.
No.
Thank you. David Willits, briefly.
Yeah, I think that we're going to need rather more than a credit card now for, for all these policies. And I think that we have to be careful. I think they should be themes that are part of a story about what it is that Conservatives want to do, rather than specific little things that hang in a vacuum. I like the idea of choice, and choice allied with the greatest possible freedom for the institutions that serve those people who choose. And I think universities, schools, hospitals are a powerful theme there. I was interested in what Michael Heseltine said about expectations on people working for their benefits. It's certainly the case that in this, as in many other areas, whatever Labour say, they simply do not deliver it in practice. I think just giving people a break, I think the prissiness and the moralising is enormously frustrating to people. And
it's really difficult to term in policy terms, isn't it? How do you explain that?
I think that the effect on the sort of popular imagination of beef on the bone or vitamin B6, the sense that this guy is telling us all how to run our lives in a tiresome way. In the 19th century, when the Liberals were much more seriously free market than the Labour Party is now, the Conservative opposition to them was based on the idea these earnest Methodists are still trying to tell us that we can't go to the pub. They're still trying to deprive the working man of his pleasures, and that is still a criticism of what Labour and the Blairites try to do today. I agree entirely with what Stephen said. I think saving is a very important issue. Catastrophic fall in the savings ratio since Labour came to power. They've been messing around with savings instruments that people understood. They've been messing around with their pension provision. People should be able to have a prospect of having a pot of their own savings at the end of their working lives, and that prospect is receding as a result of what the government is doing.
They call it a shareholder pension. Haven't they thought of that as well?
Oh, but you see, the moment...
Don't go too far down this track.
I'm not going to write that.
Okay, right.
Suffice it to say, there's less saving now than there was 2 years ago, and that is a tragedy.
And it's more taxed.
Now, scrutineers, I'm going to ask you to do something very difficult because you've got your own ideas as well. We've got about 32 ideas instead of the 5 I had in mind. Which seem to you to be the key things from this that will sell well, that would go down well, for instance, Charles, amongst your readers? Which are the key elements of these very wide-ranging ideas?
I think law and order. I think the idea of Britishness being important and being needed to be defended. I think low tax and opposition to the euro. And I think this point about bossiness too. Tony Blair is a boom phenomenon. He's like an estate agent who, when it's April and there's a rising market and all the flowers are out, he's got charming manners and he says, he rings up and he says, "I've got just the house for you." The famous estate agent's trick, and you think, oh, what a charming man, I'll buy it. But when it's November and the paint's peeling and the price of the property is going down and you're in negative equity, you can't stand the bastard. He's this smarmy fellow who promised you so much and delivered you nothing. This is
a key part of the character, because the character of this government is formed so much by its leader.
Okay.
People will come to dislike this character, and Tories must make that very clear.
I still feel you're sticking to the pendulum view, really, as well as these other ideas, but fair enough, I'll leave it there. Now, Hal Williams and Michael Gove, can you help me? Charles Moore has come up with law and order, Britishness, low tax, opposition to the euro, and an attempt to deal with the nanny state, if you like. Is there anything you'd like to vary from that you feel strongly about, that you'd like to add or subtract? Hal Williams.
Two important themes, and they're sort of classic themes, and there's a kind of creative tension between them. The Tory party always, freedom of individuals, liberty, and institutions. You know, liberals are people who think that people can just stand on their own 2 feet. Conservatives are people who actually believe in institutions and nourishing institutions. Conservative Party has a job in its hands to convince people that they can both run institutions in a humane way and recreate those institutions with independent life.
Michael Gove, any additions or alterations there before
I think we've got a lot of very interesting policy ideas. I think that what I'd want to do is to develop 2 themes under which they could fall. Themes of choice and authenticity. Michael Heston mentioned the 21st century. I have the misfortune of being the person on this panel who was born at the closest point to the start date of the 21st century. People broadly of my generation, in their 20s and 30s, have grown increasingly used to greater choice in their personal lives. Our parents' generation thought a bank account was like a marriage, something for life. We recognise that if a bank account fails, we terminate our relationship with that company and move on to another. We have to recognise that that generation which has grown used to choice demands it and recognises that it's the guarantor of good service in education, in health, where we take control of our fitness and our diet, and I think also, vitally, when it comes to politicians, which is why conservative opposition to the single currency is so important. The most important choice of all, who runs this country, should never be taken away from us. That choice is one that's instantly intelligible to my generation, and it brings me on to authenticity. If there's one thing that young people hate, it's the bogus. The thing that broadly 20 and 30-year-olds can smell about Tony Blair is the creeping Jesus, trendy vicar attempt to insinuate himself into our favour, which is deeply, reekingly inauthentic. One of the things I think, going back to what Charles and others have said, that is attractive about the Conservatives is authenticity in honesty. Words like no and never are not unattractive words in politicians, they're compelling words. Words that connote leadership, and words which bring a certain touch of certainty in an increasingly uncertain world. And I think that a Conservative leadership that has the authenticity to talk authoritatively is a Conservative leadership that can make the policies outlined this evening live.
Thank you. We have here a group of policies which might appear on this card to do with law and order, a real attempt to make punishment fit crime and people's apprehension of what is deserved by those who have committed those crimes, an attempt to increase the sense of Britishness in some fashion. A number of ways have been suggested. Low tax are related to a much more upfront attitude to admitting the way that public services will have to be paid for in future. Opposition to the euro has come from our strategists here. I know that not everyone would agree with this, but we'll put it on here for the time being, because it is a policy which I suppose could develop from current Conservative thinking, maybe not, who knows, and something which identifies the need to give individuals freedom and yet to have institutions with the power to operate outside the purlieu of the nanny state. Those are the 5 things. Is there going to be here the possibility of finding in the broad church of the Conservative Party, David Willits, the sort of pulling these ideas together in a way which can represent itself at the next election after all this dealing with Labour has been done, all the fighting and opposing has been done? Is there a way that can be achieved?
Yes, it's about personal freedom and choice rooted in a traditional country and settled institutions. And it's always been the Conservative message, and it remains the Conservative message, and it's very potent.
Stephen Dorrell.
I agree with that, with the addition of the Conservative focus on a liberal, vibrant economy.
Michael Heseltine?
The joker is Europe.
The joker is Europe. We have covered a great deal of ground tonight. I thank you all very much for taking part. So for the time being, from here, 1 Great George Street, very close to Big Ben, I'll say good night and thank you.
The Right Way Forward was chaired by Nick Clarke, the producer was Gavin Allen, and the editor, Kevin Marsh.